South of the equator, far west of Chile, there is a piece of ocean where land is still an abstraction. No shipping lane crosses it with any regularity. No coastal light reaches it. In May 1957, a bamboo raft called Tahiti Nui was there with no mast, a failing rudder, and a tow line that had just parted for the second time. She had been at sea since November of the previous year, 6 months. The men aboard had repaired what could be repaired, replaced what could be replaced, and had run out of both. The raft had already lost the controlled shape of an experiment and was showing what it had always been underneath the theory: bamboo, rope, labor, and 5 men in a very large ocean. This is not a story about a raft that crossed the Pacific. It is a story about how a rescue was turned into a proof, and how that translation may have cost a man his life. The Pacific did not sink Tahiti Nui because the theory was wrong. It nearly sank her because the first success depended on conditions the published story could not admit. What those conditions were, how they accumulated, and what happened when the same voyage was attempted without understanding them is where this story has to start. Eric de Bisschop was not trying to repeat what Thor Heyerdahl had done. He wanted to reverse its arrow. Heyerdahl had built a raft, sailed west from Peru toward Polynesia, and argued from that voyage that the Pacific Islands were settled from South America. De Bisschop looked at the same Pacific and asked the opposite question. Could a craft from Polynesia drift and be sailed toward South America? That distinction matters more than it sounds. The route was not a publicity stunt first and a theory second. For de Bisschop, the route was the argument. The ocean was the document he intended to read. Several retellings flattened Tahiti Nui into a Kon-Tiki sequel. The route premise was different. De Bisschop was testing movement from Polynesia toward South America, not the reverse. A reader who misses that difference will also miss what the failure of the second voyage actually means. He had been reading the Pacific for decades. By the 1950s, de Bisschop had spent years sailing its waters, studying currents and wind patterns, treating island traditions as evidence in themselves. He believed the scholarly consensus had not taken seriously enough the possibility of eastbound Polynesian movement. He also believed that the only way to demonstrate the feasibility of such movement was to sail it. There is something specific about the kind of certainty that forms over decades. It does not feel like stubbornness from the inside. It feels like knowledge that has been tested, refined, confirmed by experience, and simply not yet recognized by the institutions that issue recognition. By 1956, de Bisschop had spent so long believing in the eastbound route that the voyage was less a test of the idea than a demonstration of it. The difference between testing and demonstrating is significant. A test can be failed. A demonstration is designed to succeed, and a man who has designed a demonstration is not entirely free to read its results as a test. Whether or not de Bisschop understood that distinction consciously, it shaped the way the first voyage was planned and the way its results were later interpreted. Tahiti Nui was built to make a historical point. Local materials, primitive methods, bamboo lashed in the manner the theory required, and as little modern correction as possible. The construction was constrained by the argument the raft was meant to carry. To add a modern keel or reliable engine mounts or steel fastenings would have been to change the subject. A raft built as an argument has a problem a normal vessel does not. Every repair that saves the crew can also weaken the experiment. The moment you reinforce a bamboo hull with something the original builders could not have used, you are no longer answering the question you set out to ask. You are surviving it. The distinction sounds academic from shore. At sea, it becomes a pressure the crew lives inside every hour. How much can we fix before the fix becomes a refutation? De Bisschop had answered it in advance, at least in principle. The raft would be what it was built to be. What neither the construction plan nor the theory could account for was the accumulation of conditions that would eventually make the difference between a crewless wreck and 5 men brought alive to shore. Eric de Bisschop was born in 1891. By the time Tahiti Nui left Tahiti, he was not a young adventurer looking for a first reputation. He was 65 years old, sailing on a bamboo raft he had designed to answer a question the scholarly world had not conceded. A man of 65 on what may be his final opportunity to settle an argument he has carried for most of his adult life does not have the reserve of youth. He had less room to revise and less time to return. For de Bisschop, the voyage was not one experiment in a long career of experiments. It was close to the last expression of a conviction. The age is in the record, and the weight behind it helps explain not only why the first voyage happened, but why the second one did. When the first voyage ended in survival and was published as success, there was every reason, from inside that conviction, to treat it as confirmation rather than partial evidence. And confirmation is a difficult thing to look past. The crew included 5 men, and one of them mattered for reasons no migration theory could explain away. Juan Bugano was Chilean. He was the interpreter aboard the raft, the man who carried the language the coast would speak when the time came to ask for help. He was also the human link between a French-led scientific experiment drifting in the South Pacific and the Chilean naval apparatus that would determine whether that experiment ended in rescue or wreck. When the raft's radio operator transmitted the distress call in May 1957, it was received and processed by the same country that had sent one of its citizens along on the voyage. That connection does not make the rescue political. It makes it concrete, and it makes Bugano's presence something the theory alone could never have planned for. He was the practical bridge between a failing raft and a functioning state apparatus on the coast. When that bridge was needed, it existed because he was there. Another man worth holding in mind is Jean Pellissier. A retrospective account from the University of Valparaiso describes him as 23 years old when the Tahiti Nui project drew him in. He had not sailed on the first voyage. What he knew about it was what had been published and circulated, the version in which a bamboo raft had crossed the Pacific and the theory had held. He had not been in the water when the tow line parted, or on the deck in the hours Bacadano was trying to reach the raft, or in the accounts that described the structural state of the bamboo in its final weeks. He had the success story. The success story was not false. It was incomplete in the specific ways that would matter most when he was at sea on a second raft in 1958. The fatal assumption was not that bamboo could float. Bamboo can float. It is buoyant, flexible, and properly lashed it can survive conditions that would threaten a more rigid hull. The assumption was more subtle, that a raft built to satisfy a theory could keep satisfying the sea on those terms for as long as it took to arrive somewhere. Every mile east made the experiment more impressive. Every mile also made rescue less theoretical. The ocean does not know the difference between a controlled experiment and an emergency. Weather does not wait for a crew to resolve an argument about construction methods before intensifying. And a structure that has been wet, dried, stressed, and repaired for 6 continuous months is not the structure that left harbor. It is what remains of that structure, held together by the ongoing labor of men who are also tired. There is also the question of what the theory permitted the crew to do. A raft constrained by an argument about primitive construction cannot freely substitute materials, reinforce joints with modern fittings, or make the structural decisions that a purely practical crew on a purely practical vessel would make. Each repair is negotiated against the experiment's requirements. Each decision to use what is available rather than what would work best is a small concession, accumulated over months, to a framework that was designed for departure conditions rather than arrival conditions. The assumption held through the early part of the voyage. It began to fail when the raft approached the last stretch of open water before the Chilean coast, and the damage accumulating in the bamboo could no longer be managed by what the crew had aboard. Tahiti Nui left Papeete in November 1956. 5 men, a bamboo raft, a route planned along the currents and winds of the South Pacific. Contemporary press treated the departure as both experiment and spectacle. The ocean, as usual, did not read the coverage. By April 1957, she had been at sea for 5 months. The Straits Times was reporting the voyage still underway, counting it in long spans rather than dramatic incidents. That is what contemporary readers knew. Bamboo raft, months at sea, still going. What they could not know from those reports was the state of the structure producing the radio signals, or the condition of the men maintaining it. A raft at sea for that long stops being a symbol. It becomes maintenance, food, rope, rot, sleep, and weather. Every week is a week in which the lashings have been wet and dried and stressed and adjusted. Every storm leaves something slightly different from what it found. The structural integrity that existed in Papeete Harbor in November did not exist intact in April. It existed in modified form, held together by the ongoing decisions of the crew working with what they had brought and what they could improvise. Bamboo absorbs water over time. Lashings stretch, fray, and have to be retightened or replaced. A raft that sits lower in the water than it did at departure is carrying more weight in its structure, and that weight compounds the stress on every joint. The men on Tahiti Nui were not simply passengers on a theoretical argument. They were working sailors on a deteriorating platform, making daily decisions about what to fix, what to leave, and what could wait. Those decisions are not in the popular account of the voyage because they are not the kind of detail that makes the theory look confirmed. They are in the rescue record, which is where the actual conditions of the crossing left their clearest mark. That maintenance is part of the survival record, and it is largely invisible in the accounts that frame the voyage as a triumph of design. The clean version of the Tahiti Nui story says the raft crossed the Pacific. The records are messier. They describe damage that accumulated over months of exposure, tow attempts that failed, a naval response that had to be coordinated across significant distance, and a final approach to safety that depended on other vessels entering the story at the right moment. Those conditions do not erase the achievement. They define it. A voyage that survives because the crew managed their deteriorating equipment skillfully enough to remain rescuable until rescue arrived is a real achievement. It is not the achievement the theory needed it to be, but it is a real one. By late May 1957, Tahiti Nui was close enough to Juan Fernandez for Chilean vessels to act, and still far enough out for the raft to be in genuine danger. Juan Fernandez is a Chilean island group, roughly 400 miles off the coast, known historically as the location associated with Alexander Selkirk, the maroon sailor whose story became Robinson Crusoe. In May 1957, it was the nearest fixed reference point in a radio message asking for help. The Singapore Free Press reported in late May that Tahiti Nui had transmitted a distress signal and that Chilean naval assets were responding. The open ocean abstraction of the voyage gave way to something with coordinates, timelines, and naval orders. The raft had moved from being a symbol in transit to being an object with a position that had to be reached. For the Chilean Navy, the operation was concrete, a vessel in distress at a known set of coordinates, in weather that complicated approach, with a crew whose condition after 6 months at sea was unknown. The theoretical significance of the bamboo was not the Navy's concern. Getting the men off before the structure failed completely was. The rescue accounts of those final weeks do not read like a triumphal landfall. They read like seamanship under pressure. The Revista de Marina account, drawing on Chilean naval records, describes an operation involving the vessel Baquedano and what followed as a sequence of complications. A mast problem, failure of steering control, heavy weather arriving at the wrong moment, and a tow line that parted. A tow line sounds simple from shore. At sea and weather, between a steel naval hull and a bamboo raft, it is a fragile agreement between two bodies moving differently through the same swell. A bamboo raft does not follow a powered vessel the way a conventional craft would. It moves with the water rather than through it. When the swell runs against the direction of tow, the two vessels work at cross purposes, and the line between them bears the force of both movements at once. When the tow line failed, Tahiti Nui was back inside the conditions she had been built to test. Open water, no external power, no margin for further deterioration. The difference was that she was no longer intact. 6 months of Pacific weather had already done their work on the structure. The raft facing those conditions alone in the hours after the tow failed was not the raft that had left Papeete. It was what remained of that raft in weather at sea, waiting for Baquedano to return. That waiting is not in the record in any detailed form. What the record shows is that the rescue eventually succeeded. The vessel returned. The men came off the raft alive. What the hours of that interval felt like to 5 men on a deteriorating bamboo platform, without a functioning mast, without a working rudder, with the Pacific doing what it does at that latitude in May, is not something naval logs or contemporary press accounts can fully reconstruct. An emergency is poorly documented from the inside. The documentation comes afterward, in naval reports and press cables, and eventually in the memoir that turns the interval into a passage through danger toward a conclusion that was always going to come. But the conclusion was not always going to come. The conclusion came because Bacadano returned, and because the weather permitted the approach, and because the men on the raft had managed the structure well enough through 6 months of deterioration to still be on something that could be reached. Those conditions were not guaranteed. They were present. The record shows they were present. The record does not present them as the point of the story, because by the time the story was being written, the men were alive and the theory was intact, and there was no obvious reason to center the account on what might have gone differently. The men survived. That fact is solid. The meaning of that survival is the unstable part. A rescued experiment is not the same proof as an unaided arrival. The raft did not touch the Chilean coast under its own management after a self-sufficient crossing. It arrived with assistance, after damage, after tow line failure, after weeks of structural deterioration. The crew had managed as long as they could. The distance covered was real. The conditions under which it was covered were not the conditions the theory had proposed to test. The public story that emerged from the voyage preserved one more clearly than the other. Contemporary press reports followed Tahiti Nui as an adventure story in progress. Months at sea, a wireless plea, a rescue near Chile. Each account was accurate about what it reported. None of them were in a position to report what the voyage had depended on that the theory could not have predicted. De Bisschop's own account, published after the voyage, made the raft's survival part of the argument he wanted the voyage to carry. A memoir written after survival has already given the story a direction is a different document from a naval rescue log written during the operation. De Bisschop could make the voyage cohere as an argument. The rescue record makes it cohere as a sequence of conditions. Both are real. They describe the same events from positions that could not fully see each other. My read is that Tahiti Nui's first voyage is strongest when treated as survival evidence and weakest when treated as a clean historical proof. The raft showed what bamboo, drift, labor, and rescue timing could do together. It did not isolate which of those factors had saved the men, because the voyage could not be designed to isolate them. The theory required one kind of raft. The survival required several kinds of conditions the theory had not budgeted for. A raft can prove that a voyage is possible without proving that a migration happened. That distinction is small enough to lose in publicity and large enough to matter historically. Modern experimental archaeology treats the question of Polynesian origins as more complicated than any single raft success or failure could resolve. What Tahiti Nui demonstrated was what bamboo, drift, human labor, rescue timing, and Chilean naval capacity could accomplish together under specific conditions. That is a real body of evidence about the feasibility of sustained ocean travel on a primitive raft. It is not the same as what the published accounts suggested it was. The later Tahiti Nui voyage did not happen in a vacuum. It followed a published success, a public theory, and a man who had reason to believe the sea had already answered him once. De Bisschop was not finished after the first rescue. He had survived, and surviving had confirmed something for him that the first voyage had not yet fully settled in his own terms. He built another raft. He assembled another crew. The second attempt began not long after the first rescue, and its ambition was to do what the first voyage had not quite managed: reach the destination on the raft's own terms, without the assistance of Chilean naval vessels, without a tow line that had already parted twice. This time the direction was different. The second raft, also called Tahiti Nui, was aimed at a return crossing from South America back toward Polynesia, completing what de Bisschop saw as the full demonstration of his theory. The currents and winds of that route were different from the first voyage. The conditions that had kept the first raft alive long enough for rescue were not automatically present on the second. The raft carried its crew into the Pacific again, into a route that would bring it toward the Cook Islands chain. Tahiti Nui II did not reach its destination. As the structure deteriorated beyond what repair could address, the crew abandoned what remained of it and built a smaller emergency raft from what could still float. That third raft, Tahiti Nui III, was what the sea eventually carried toward Rakahanga. It wrecked there in 1958, and de Bisschop died. The secondary accounts describe the circumstances with appropriate caution. Conditions were severe. The structure was already an emergency measure built from the remnants of a failing one. And the man who had crossed the Pacific on bamboo did not survive what the bamboo became at the end. He was 67 years old. The Chilean naval vessels that had reached the first Tahiti Nui in May 1957 were not on that route at that moment in position to reach him again. The detail matters. The second voyage did not fail the way a single catastrophic event might look from shore. It failed progressively through accumulated deterioration and the narrowing of options, until what remained was not a raft built to prove a theory, but a raft built from the pieces of one. In that respect, the second failure was a compressed version of what the first rescue had interrupted. Jean Policier was aboard the second raft. He had inherited the success story of the first voyage and stepped onto the second raft carrying it. There is a particular quality to second-hand knowledge of someone else's survival. The gaps are not visible as gaps. The missing conditions do not announce themselves as missing. What Policier had was a coherent narrative. A man with a theory, a raft built to test it, an ocean crossed, a crew brought home. That narrative was accurate in its broad shape. It was incomplete in its specific conditions. The Bacadano was not in that narrative as a structural necessity. The tow line failures were not in that narrative as the moments on which the outcome had turned. The 6 months of ongoing repair and deterioration were not in that narrative as the context inside which the rescue had to succeed before the raft could no longer remain rescuable. The conditions that had made the crossing survivable rather than fatal were not highlighted in the published account, because highlighting them would have complicated the conclusion. And so Policier stepped aboard the second raft with the conclusion, and without what the conclusion depended on. Later adventure accounts of the Tahiti Nui II voyages, written after de Bisschop's death, preserve important sequence and crew memory, but they are not neutral rescue records. They are valuable as testimony. They should be read as testimony, not as independent verification. A cautious reading of the record suggests the dangerous omission was not a lie. It was emphasis. The public story preserved the courage and the theory more cleanly than it preserved the rescue conditions. It was less careful about Bacadano, the tow line failures, the structural deterioration, the timing of the rescue relative to the raft's remaining capacity to survive another night. That kind of omission can matter more than an error, because it tells the next voyage what to remember. An error can be noticed and corrected. An emphasis does not present itself as something missing. It presents itself as the story. The story of the first Tahiti Nui voyage, as it was published and received, was a story of bamboo proving a theory with human courage at its center. The conditions that made that story possible were in the record, but not at the center of it. The second voyage departed with the center of the story, and without what the record showed about the margins. I do not think the record lets us say de Bisschop ignored what the first voyage had taught. The record does not give us access to what he privately understood. What it lets us say is that the lesson was harder to see once survival had been turned into proof. Once a voyage has been published as a success, the conditions that made it a conditional success are less visible than the success itself. The proof is in the foreground. The rescue is in the background. The naval vessels are a supporting detail. The theory is the conclusion. That is not ignorance. That is what happens to difficult events when they pass through the machinery of publication and public reception. The event becomes the story becomes the evidence, and the evidence is treated as if it were the same as the event, which it never is. What remains is a question about the distance between what de Bisschop understood and what the public record preserved. The unanswered question is not simply whether Polynesians could have moved east or west across the Pacific. The scholarly work on that question continues with evidence that a bamboo raft's survival in 1957 could not settle and could not refute. The question at the center of the Tahiti Nui record is whether the first voyage taught the lesson it contained. A man and his crew survived 6 months on a bamboo raft, were rescued by naval vessels near Juan Fernandez, and arrived alive on the Chilean coast. A published account of that survival became the basis for a second attempt. The second attempt ended in death near Rakahanga in 1958. The record between those 2 points shows a gap between what made the first voyage survivable and what the public story said had made it survivable. What remains open is not only whether de Bisschop was right about Polynesian routes, but whether he ever understood which conditions had saved him the first time.